Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Tom's Hardware Piecast. I'll give a few seconds, as always, for folks to start filtering in, our audience to start joining us on where we are on YouTube, Facebook, Periscope, and Twitch Live. And I just got an alert that the podcast is starting. That's really good to know. Anyway, so as always, I'm Abram Pilch, Tom's Hardware's editor-in-chief, and I'm joined, as always, by Raspberry Pi expert Ash Puckett and associate editor Les Pounder. And this week, we have two very special guests who are behind bringing official Ubuntu desktop to Raspberry Pi just a few days ago, and they are Martin Wimpress and Rhys Davies. Hi, guys.
Hello. Thanks for having us on.
So, for our audience, could you tell us a little bit about yourselves and what you do? I guess starting with you, Martin.
Sure. So I'm engineering director for Ubuntu Desktop at Canonical, and a long-time member of the Raspberry Pi community in the UK.
I'm Rhys Davies. I'm a product manager at Canonical who looks after, among other things, the Raspberry Pi based initiatives. I'm a long-term tinkerer and geek with these sorts of things. So it was my pleasure to be a part of this in Canonical.
It's really fantastic. So this is the first, just for our audience who may not be totally up on the history of Ubuntu on Raspberry Pi. This is the first full desktop version, but you've been able to use Ubuntu on Raspberry Pi before and sort of install a desktop. Can you guys talk about what the difference is now versus before?
So I'll do this one, Martin. So previously you could install Ubuntu Core and Ubuntu Server without any problems on the Raspberry Pi. We have an amazing certification team who have made sure that will just work out of the box from download. But those are even I guess a little bit less user friendly to what the majority of the Raspberry Pi audience is used to with Raspberry Pi OS or with Raspbian previously. The big difference here is the desktop comes with the full fat version with all of the GUI and all of the desktop support and running things the way people are more likely used to be running their desktops as a workstation or as just a general sort of PC.
Wow, that's great. So how long were you guys working on this, and what were some of the challenges that you had porting it to Raspberry Pi?
So specifically this sort of first outing for the desktop, which now, completes the family of Ubuntu operating systems for the Pi. We've been working on that for the last 6 months, but you can't just do that in isolation. All of the work that Rhys has just spoken about, enabling the server and Ubuntu Core, obviously plays its part in getting there. So there are a number of teams at Canonical, as you can probably imagine. One of the teams is called the Foundations team, and they're responsible for all of the common underpinnings that sit beneath every sort of Ubuntu family member. And we have dedicated Raspberry Pi engineers on that team. In fact, I would be surprised if Dave isn't in chat this evening. This is Dave Jones, who is also, a significant contributor in the Raspberry Pi community and has been for many years. And we're fortunate to have him working at Canonical. So there's the work that he does there. And then we also have dedicated kernel engineering to make sure that the kernel that we ship is in line with all of the latest changes and features and capabilities that the Raspberry Pi Foundation are working on upstream. And then we have the desktop team, and they've done the bit on top to deliver an optimized desktop shell on top of all of that. And that's been the focus of the last 6 months of work, but with a particular focus on the Raspberry Pi 4 and, of course, the V3D and VC4 enablement to do all of the compositing and 3D stuff, and also camera enablement and what have you. So that sort of the last 6 months building on some years of work beneath it, and it was really with the advent of the 4 and 8 gig models, particularly the 8 gig model of the Raspberry Pi 4, that we saw a real opportunity to bring the Ubuntu desktop to the Raspberry Pi.
That's awesome. And Les, I know you've spent a lot of time testing the new Ubuntu. What are some of your thoughts?
I find it really good. It's a nice mix of a desktop computer operating system and something more akin to Raspberry Pi OS, sort of a meeting of the two. So I can use it for just using normal browsing, messing around, writing documents, that sort of thing. But I can also use it for GPIO and camera work as well. So it's really good, especially with an NVMe drive over USB 3. It's blindingly fast.
Wow. So, Martin, I think you said you might have a demo set up. Is it working yet?
It's in the final. I mean, I can switch to it. It's in the final stages of the initial setup at the moment, so I can definitely hop over there. I just remember I need to hit this button here, and if I ping that, hopefully you can see my Raspberry Pi 4, which is on my desk in front of me. And when you put the Ubuntu image on a Raspberry Pi 4, which you can use the Pi Imager to do, so you don't need to mess around. You just fire up the Pi Imager. You'll find an Ubuntu category in there with all of the Ubuntu family available, including the new desktop release. So you can just stick that on your SD card, and it will take you through a first run wizard. And this is the end of that process, which is just completing the cleanup after you've configured your username and password and said where you are in the world and configured your network and all of that sort of thing. I can't tell how much longer this has to run, but you can see here behind our progress bar, you can see our groovy gorilla mascot wearing his Raspberry Pi tinted glasses, which our design and brand team came up with to sort of celebrate this release. And I think it's a fantastic mascot, particularly this version with the Raspberry Pi there. I'll switch back to my camera whilst that's finishing, and I'll let you know when the desktop is available.
So we have a question. Real Cody the Dragon asks, question, how does the Ubuntu Pi dev team plan to handle the load GNOME's compositor puts on the Pi 4 GPU? Seems to be a common issue with the Pi 4 and distros.
Right. So we've already done some work on that this cycle. There was in fact, if you're familiar with the goings on in sort of, the Linux space around GNOME and the desktop shell, Daniel Van Vogt is one of the Ubuntu desktop team members and an upstream GNOME contributor. And his specialist area is improving performance in GNOME shell, reducing latency in the desktop shell, and optimization of the graphics stack. He's already done a few tweaks for this release in order to get us where we are, and we have a whole roadmap of activities planned for further fixes and improvements to optimize the shell for the GNOME shell on Raspberry Pi 4, and that includes lowering latency and also, in some cases, reducing the memory footprint. So that'll be coming in the 2104 release in April next year, hopefully.
So this is really just the beginning, because you expect Raspberry Pi to be supported, a Raspberry Pi version of every new Ubuntu launch to come out at launch.
That's right. Ubuntu Desktop for the Raspberry Pi is now an official release architecture. It's a reference platform, and we'll be pushing out a release for the Raspberry Pi just as we do for PC at the same time. It's not special cased in any way. It's just a release platform for us now.
Great. So are you guys working at all with, or do you need to work at all with some of the companies that are making hats and other accessories for the Raspberry Pi to make them work with Ubuntu Desktop?
So we're not working with them directly yet. The initial 6 months of work for the Ubuntu Desktop has really gone into making sure that we have the full Ubuntu experience out of the box on the Raspberry Pi. But in the coming weeks and months and releases, we're going to hopefully start working with the Pi hats with all of the various add-ons and extras that our community made, and start trying to get that in as well. What we really want to aim for is a complementary version of Ubuntu that really matches Raspberry Pi OS and with all the extra things that come with the community.
Fantastic.
And in order to get to where we are today, it hasn't happened in isolation. Rhys has worked hard to establish engineering level contact between Canonical and the Raspberry Pi Foundation. So every other week, we have two meetings scheduled with engineers at the Pi Foundation to look at upcoming kernel changes, upcoming changes in their user space, user land, and firmware. And we're working collaboratively on improving the experience of Ubuntu on Raspberry Pi. And then where there's common ground for us to work together, we're working with the engineers at the Pi Foundation to sort of help with their burden as well. So helping get things upstream and what have you. So, we've got a really good dialogue going at an engineering level between the two organizations now, which is part of the reason why we've been able to, do this.
So I have to ask a question that's probably on everyone's mind. What's that behind you?
Behind me?
Yes, behind Martin.
It's a screen. It's a computer. It's a Raspberry Pi. In fact, that's the desktop wallpaper on a Raspberry Pi on the computer behind me.
That's cool. It has some kind of like sign above it.
That is a little IoT device called a Lametric, not powered by a Raspberry Pi, as it happens, but that's what that is. Yeah.
Very cool. So did it finish setting up?
It has finished, yes.
Right.
I can switch to that now. So this is the desktop, and as you can see, if you're familiar with Ubuntu, this is just Ubuntu. There's nothing unusual. I'll just launch a terminal, and here we go. Maybe we need to just increase the font size there so people can see. So yes, at this point, it's just a regular Ubuntu terminal. So if we just install that, and so I'm connected to the network. You can install software in all the usual ways. You can get things via apt through the Ubuntu Software Center and the Snap Store. So I've just installed NeoFetch because that's a nice way to give you a quick overview to prove this is in fact a Raspberry Pi. And there it is, Ubuntu 2010 on a Pi B Model 4 with 8 gigs. And this is a 5.8 kernel. And I suppose it's worth highlighting that point is, although we have what's called an optimized kernel for the Raspberry Pi, it is just the same as the kernel that's available for the PC and the cloud partners. It's an Ubuntu kernel with the extra bits that you need in order to make it work properly on a Raspberry Pi. So everything you can do on Ubuntu everywhere else, you can do on a Raspberry Pi, including, standing up clusters using microcates and LXD and virtual machines, and just everything you would expect to do on Ubuntu, you can do here without any compromises.
So does it already support the Raspberry Pi 4 8 gigabytes? Can you use all 8 gigabytes with it?
Yes, I'm running it on an 8 gig model here, and you can quite comfortably fill 8 gigs of RAM if you really want to. And I've done that using LXD to stand up a cluster of containers.
Fantastic. So another question from Cody. Will these Ubuntu ARM releases slowly start supporting other single board computers as time goes on? Or is Pi 4 and beyond the key focus?
So Raspberry Pi, the family of Raspberry Pis, is the focus at the moment. It's a reference platform for Ubuntu, both in terms of our IoT Ubuntu Core and also the classic server and now the desktop.
So the likes of Ubuntu Server and Ubuntu Core work with the majority of the Raspberry Pi family at the moment, all the way down to the Pi 2. It's just the Ubuntu desktop that we're recommending for now, that people only run on the Raspberry Pi 4 with 4 gigabytes or 8 gigabytes of RAM, just because it needs a bit more juice.
Yeah. No doubt. I also noticed behind Martin a Picade. So I have to ask: is there how is emulation on this? Can you do emulation on Ubuntu for Raspberry Pi?
Yes, you can, handsomely, in fact. And within the community, this is a pet project of mine. I started a little project a few months ago called the Ubuntu Retro Remix, which is going to be, an Ubuntu specially dedicated to retro emulation. And in the box next to me, my box of Pi stuff, I have, a collection of different styled retro cases from, the 8 and 16-bit era. And then this project behind me, which has been many years on my, bucket list, I'm finally going to get round to putting that together. And I've also got, monster joysticks and what have you. So slowly enabling support for all of those bits and pieces.
That's awesome. So is it going to be like you're going to have a disk image that people can download and burn?
Yes, something like that. So to start, at the moment, it's just a script that you can run to transform the server image into this, emulator. But it's very rudimentary at the moment. But yes, this is going to be a sort of a hobby project of mine over the coming months, and eventually will create images that are dedicated to particular cases and platforms. So it will create you a Nintendo Entertainment System image or a PlayStation image or something specific for the Retrocade.
So it's going to be a new custom UI. It's not going to piggyback off of RetroPie or something.
I've been experimenting with not RetroPie, so I've been using Ludo, which is one of the new emulator front ends, and also what's the other really popular one that everyone uses?
Waka?
No, is it not Emulation Station? RetroArch. It's RetroArch, yes. So the current image that I've got, or the scripts that I've got at the moment, stand up and configure RetroArch as the front end. But I've also been looking at Ludo, and I'll make a decision which way I'm going to go at some point. But the projects are on my GitHub, and
cool.
Yeah.
Wow, that's really awesome. So do you think that with Ubuntu, emulation will run about the same as it does on Raspberry Pi OS, better or not quite as well?
I don't see any reason why it won't run as well. Where the way that I'm doing things is, you're probably familiar, the Raspberry Pi Foundation are moving all of their graphics stack to use sort of the familiar libraries and APIs that exist in the Linux world, rather than sort of the proprietary solutions that are embedded on the SoC. So with that, that's what we're hooking into. So OpenGL and Vulkan and all of those things. So we'll be doing it in a traditional, Linuxy way, rather than leaning on the acceleration that's been available through the proprietary extensions in the SoC. But it works very well now. It's all accelerated, so as a fully 3D accelerated emulation front end, it works very well.
Fantastic. So what can folks look forward to with Ubuntu on the Pi? What's next for it? What are some of the capabilities that you want to bring to it?
So I read the article that Les posted with interest, and he was drawing some comparisons as to the GPIO experience on Ubuntu versus Raspberry Pi OS, and we're well aware that we can do better to refine that GPIO experience on Ubuntu, and that's going to be a focus for the next release, so that that is more familiar and there is less friction when you want to hook up your devices and hats and what have you. And we're going to be, in fact, we've already started canvassing our community for their feedback based on this release. We want to build out the portfolio of hat modules and things like that that people are commonly using. We obviously can't catch up with 8 years of stuff that's available for Raspberry Pi OS, but we can make a start, and we're going to burn down that list in an order of priority based on community feedback. And I suppose after this we can supply you with some links where people can provide their feedback, and those that do, there's an opportunity to win some Ubuntu Groovy Gorilla with Raspberry Pi glasses swag. So we value your feedback.
So are people going to dress up as the Groovy Gorilla for Halloween?
That would be amazing. Anyone that tweets pictures of themselves to the Ubuntu Twitter account dressed as the Groovy Gorilla for Halloween, instant t-shirt win, I think, don't you, Rhys?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
if you can beat my gorilla costume, we'll see how it goes, Les. We'll see how it goes.
You need the glasses. So speaking of Halloween, Les, you have managed to wire up a pumpkin to Twitter using Raspberry Pi.
I have indeed, yes. So you have seen behind me there is a pumpkin, and I'm just going to turn the light on now.
Would you call it a Jack Dorsey lantern?
No, probably not. So this pumpkin is wired up to the internet using a Raspberry Pi 4 and an Explorer Hat Pro inside of it. I'm still getting over Ash's joke. So inside the Raspberry Pi 4 there's also a load of LEDs. Now, I've not just gone to a maker store and bought a load of LEDs. I've gone to a dollar store or a pound store in the UK and bought these. These are just Halloween LED lights, and I've chopped the end off these lights, and I'll just quickly put a slideshow on. And they're just standard LEDs. You get some AA batteries and put them up and light up your house with. And they're connected to an Explorer Hat Pro with Raspberry Pi 4 underneath, and they're then stuffed inside very gently into the pumpkin to light up. And then you'll see it lights up behind me. So I've got full control of this using something called Node-RED. Now, normally when programming a Raspberry Pi, we instantly think, oh, we must go and use Python straight away. But there are a myriad of languages that we can use, and Node-RED is quite a popular one for Internet of Things projects. So I'm going to show you what Node-RED looks like. So as you can see, this is the Node-RED interface. We have on the left-hand side of the screen some nodes. These are our building blocks for code. The code is built in the center of the screen. That's called the flow. And to create a flow of code, we just join lines between blocks of code, the nodes. So I can join stuff by just dragging across like this. So I've got these nodes all set up to trigger certain actions. So I can turn on the pumpkin. Now, hopefully you can still see me. So I'm going to turn the pumpkin on now. And I can turn it off. I've also got a Twitter little script going here, which is looking for the hashtag the PiCast. And whenever someone tweets hashtag the PiCast, and if anyone would like to do it now, you're very welcome, it will light up the pumpkin for 5 seconds. Then it will turn off the pumpkin, ready for the next user. And if loads of people hit it, it just queues up all of these instructions, say, right, turn the lights on after it's done. And I can see what's going on here, what's been turned on, what's been turned off in the debug area, which I'm just slightly obscuring with my head. But also with Node-RED, I've got a user interface. I can build a dashboard. So I built a very quick dashboard called Pumpkin Control, and I can control the LED in the pumpkin from there. Live demo, it's going to go wrong, isn't it? Yes, it has. There we go. But I can go back and I can turn it on this way. So what's happening here is I'm just injecting, the servers have gone down, that's always handy. I'm just injecting code called a topic, which is like the subject of an email. And the contents of the email, the payload, contains a 0 or a 1, off or on. And the Explorer Hat node just here reacts to that input, saying the message topic is output.1, so the first output on the Explorer Hat. If I receive 1, I know to turn on the output and to turn on the pumpkin. If I see a 0, it turns off. And in the debug area, this is what I see here. Now, Node-RED isn't very difficult to program in. It's just you need to think about how flows work and how you would like the events to trigger certain things to happen. So if you've got a good programming brain already, so you've done some Python or some JavaScript, you're pretty much there to use Node-RED. Even if you've used Scratch, you could have a go with just sending simple messages to the debug console to prove that you can do hello world. And I really like it. So I'm going to go back to my camera now.
Would you describe this as Node-RED as Scratch for adults?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, it's a programming language for people who don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of programming, but want to get something done really quickly. So an example of which is there is a professor, Lucy Rogers, in the UK, who was a judge on Robot Wars many years ago, and she's a friend of mine. Her team goes to an amusement park on the Isle of Wight every year called Black Gang Chine. And there they have animatronic dinosaurs, which are controlled using Raspberry Pis and Node-RED. And they're programmed in Node-RED, so the staff who work on the park can easily use a really clear interface to control the dinosaurs without having to get into the depths of programming languages. They just know that if they click this button here, then the Tyrannosaurus Rex is going to make a roaring sound. But they can also chain the dinosaurs together. So the T-Rex makes a noise, the Stegosaurus makes a noise, the Pterodactyl makes a noise and flaps its wings, all using Node-RED.
That makes it really accessible. That's really cool.
It's great.
Yeah.
So how did you get the module for the Pimoroni Explorer hat? Was that something that Pimoroni provides, or did you have to create it?
Pimoroni created it. So if I just quickly go back to the capture, I have Manage Palette here. And it's a basic package manager for installing software. So if I type in Explorer Hat, there you go, you can see it's installed. I can click on that, install the package, and it will work. Now, there is a prerequisite to this. I do have to have the Explorer Hat Python library installed as well, but that's really easy to do. It's a single line terminal command on the Raspberry Pi just to install that hat and get it working straight away. And then just install this, and away I go. And it's the same with Twitter. The Twitter node used to be a standard node that came with Node-RED, but unfortunately it's not now. It's something extra. But it's just a quick install using Manage Palette. I then set up a default application, so a Twitter application. And then I can use that to monitor tweets or hashtags or DMs or anything like that for certain occurrences, and it will trigger the script to run.
So I have a question for Martin and Rhys. Does Node-RED run on Ubuntu desktop for Raspberry Pi?
Yes.
So,
in fact, we've worked with the developers of Node-RED at a couple of our Snapcraft summits in order to sort of refine things. I love Node-RED. It's really great. It's a great way to prototype.
fantastic.
things.
Speaking of prototypes, Ash, you have a prototype robot that you want to show everybody.
I do. I have a work in progress. This is I'm going to get my camera switched over here. I'll move my light. This is a robot that my beautiful, brilliant fiance has been putting together. It's based on a Sunfounder robot kit, like a little spider walking robot kit. And it's been modified by the internet a few times. It's been passed along the community. The housing here, the shell for it has been redesigned a couple of times. This iteration was made by my fiance Justin to fit these bigger servo motors. And what I'm going to do is flip the little guy's on switch here so you can see what he does. Now he's programmed to run a little demo. He might be noisy. You might hear him on the microphone as he wiggles and stuff. But what he's going to do is just stand up and sit down. He can walk forward and back. And he's equipped with a variety of sensors, one of which I have here. He's got an IR sensor in the front. And one of the programs we have running, he'll walk around, and if he gets too close to something, he'll stop and he'll rotate until the IR sensor detects that there's nothing too close in front of him, and then he'll go that direction and he'll stop and he'll turn around, and then he'll go that direction and he'll just run around. we've been working on making him run faster and faster, so he's not just a slow robot. He can like skitter across the floor and scare the cats. It's pretty fun. The main board that it uses, though, this is probably the most interesting part. Now, I know that this is a Raspberry Pi podcast, so apologize, this is not Pi powered. But here's the board it's using. This is called a Arduino, and it is a clone of an Arduino Nano, which I've got one of these here. It's a little hard to see. But this board actually has a little bit extra. It's designed to like helps handle a little more power a little better than the Nano does, but you kind of need it for these servo motors because these are some intense servos. We had to change the batteries on it twice just to get enough juice for it to run, and if you let it run for too long, it'll eventually reset and it can't power itself. But that's our little robot project. There's a Bluetooth module we're looking at adding. I think it would be, he's going to walk off the screen. He'll come back. But I think we've been looking at ways we can incorporate a Raspberry Pi because this is pretty much an Arduino that's running the servos. You could have a Raspberry Pi that uses something like, I don't know, a camera with TensorFlow, and it could direct the Arduino on when to use the servos and do the walking commands. So there's a lot of Raspberry Pi potential.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, I think the holy grail, well, not the holy, what we're trying to do in my house is my son really wants me to figure out how we can do OpenCV on his Raspberry Pi powered car, and what the missing piece is that we just need to get more power, because we were fooling around with his STS Pi, which is I have it here somewhere, with his STS Pi, which is now a little bit in pieces, and this is a Pimoroni car kit with Explorer hat that Les was using actually in his demo, same hat. And we have the camera on it, but with the USB battery that we're using, for some reason it gets low voltage if I try to do object recognition. If I run the car and I run the camera, no problem. But if I try to do object recognition, it gives me the little lightning bolt. So I think what I need to do is get a different type of power supply, maybe one of those battery hats out there to give it a little bit more juice. I think that's something that I don't know if any of you guys have encountered, but the kind of USB batteries that a lot of people use for phones, I don't think cut it very well when it comes to, if you have a small one, you can have a big one, but if you have a small one, it's a little hard to have something that's a friendly form factor to put onto a robot. So someone actually has a question about your robot, Ash. Oh, looks like the killer robot from Runaway. Oh, that's a deep cut. I love it. I love it. How many people here have seen that movie?
Let's compare it to the spider robots from Watch Dogs earlier.
What's the battery life like using servos as opposed to motors?
That's a good question. We haven't experimented using stepper motors, only servos, and it's because of the shell that we started with that was 3D printed. Somebody else designed it specifically for a certain model of servos, and if we were to switch it to stepper motors or something like that, it would be a pain in the rear end to totally redesign it, because we had to go into Blender. Oh, he's waving. That's a wave. We had to go into Blender and redesign the legs to fit the new equipment that we changed it. So that's a good question, but I don't have a direct answer for it.
Ash, are you going to put this up on GitHub or someplace when you consider it to be in a final state?
He needs to. There's links to a few other ones that other people have made. Like I said, this is just a chain of modifications that other people have made. There are 4 or 5 other ones that are using really similar components, and I can send links to those so we can have people check that out.
Yes, I think we need to do a how to make a Spiderbot story.
Yes,
so
that'd be
Ash,
really cool. Yeah.
When you come to reimagine your robot using a Raspberry Pi, I'd invite you to use Ubuntu to do that, because not many people realize this, but we have a robotics team at Canonical. So we have 4 roboticists working on the robot operating system, which sits on top of Ubuntu, with the full sort of palette of all of the sensors and vision tools, just everything you can imagine available there. And if you go and search through the Ubuntu blog, you will find all manner of content in there for starter projects and what have you, and some more advanced stuff as well. And I think at the moment on the Celebrate Ubuntu YouTube channel, there's a number of videos being trickled out covering various aspects of using the robot operating system on Ubuntu and on the Raspberry Pi.
That is super cool. I need to check that out for sure.
Fantastic, because that's where the real fun comes in with Raspberry Pi. I mean, it's fun to use it as an operating system and to program in it, but I think I really enjoy it the most when I can plug in a physical device to my Raspberry Pi and make it do something like that. So yeah, that's really cool. Well, that's all the time we have today, but I want to thank Martin and Rhys from Ubuntu for coming on to talk about Ubuntu Desktop for Raspberry Pi. As always, thank you to all of you who watched live. You can catch up with us on YouTube, Facebook, or Twitch. You can find this archivally and also the audio version wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, we are here at 2:30 p.m. Eastern, 6:30 p.m. British time every Tuesday. See you next week. Bye.